Hello and welcome to the second part of a talk on Moses Roper, an African American freedom fighter and abolitionist and social justice campaigner. And I'm so lucky to be here as part of Douglas Week and for hosting not one but two sessions on telling Moses Roper's story with you. In this second part, it's just me, and I wanted to finish the conversation that myself and Caroline started as part of our part one, discussing Moses Roper's life, his activism, and we had such a lovely and enriching conversation. And it's my pleasure to be here just to finish up on a couple of things that we just didn't have time to talk about in our last talk, essentially. So this is going to be about 10 minutes, just as I sort of wrap up some of the themes, some of the questions that we introduced in the first half. But just to summarize, if those of you who haven't seen the first part, or just to summarize essentially some of the things that we talked about in the first part. Who was Moses Roper? And Roper was an African American activist. He was an abolitionist, an author, orator, social justice campaigner. He was a survivor of enslavement. He was born in North Carolina in 1815. He was a pioneer in the anti-slavery and the anti-racist movement. He challenged enslavement, racism, white supremacy, and scientific racism as well. Throughout the 19th century, Roper constantly risked his life, his well-being to try and liberate his family and to try and liberate as many African Americans as possible from enslavement in the US. He had a significant impact on transatlantic society, particularly Britain and Ireland. He travelled over to here in 1835, and he lectured across Ireland and across Britain as well, reaching the Scottish Highlands all the way down to rural Cornish and Welsh villages, particularly in Wales, where Welsh would have been a first language. So it's interesting to think about those sorts of translation conversations. But he lectured thousands of times around Britain in particular, and spoke in town halls and churches and chapels, anywhere where he could get a hearing. And he published a pioneering autobiography that was published here in the UK in 1837. The year later, it was published in the US in 1838, and it went through multiple editions and sold tens of thousands of copies. And Roper was a very radical activist, a very pioneering activist for all of these reasons and so many more. And his speeches, where he actually discusses sending copies of that autobiography to, in his words, as many slaveholders as he could remember, where he was enslaved not only in North Carolina, but South Carolina and Florida as well. One of the other things that he did, particularly on British soil, is that he really challenged British complicity with the slave trade and also with enslavement. Britain still does to this day, but particularly in the 19th century, and particularly when Roper was giving lectures in the late 1830s and early 1840s, Britain liked to champion itself that Britain had abolished the slave trade and also enslavement across the British Empire. But Roper pointed out some of the hypocrisies around that. And he also pointed out that American enslavement existed in large part because of Britain, and Britain continued to allow American enslavement to exist for several reasons, but particularly because it accepted thousands and thousands of bales of cotton every year coming into Liverpool that was grown by enslaved labor in the US. And Roper called that out. He also called out that there were many British businesses, British shops that created and sold weapons of torture that were shipped over to the US and were used by white enslavers and white men and white women against enslaved people. So, and there he tells this one story of how he was walking down the streets of Birmingham and he saw one of these shops and he went into the shop and Roper could pass for white, and the clerk in the shop believed that he was a white man looking to purchase some of these weapons of torture. And Roper did a very powerful performance technique where he actually revealed his identity, but he did so by handing the clerk his autobiography and said, if you read my book, if you read my autobiography, you will realize that you should completely stop selling these items because this is the reality of what happens when you sell these weapons of torture and what happens to enslaved women, men, and children when these weapons of torture are used on bodies and souls. So he had a really, really powerful impact on the British landscape. With this particular performance technique, in nearly every lecture that I can find written about in the newspapers, Roper is exhibiting weapons of torture because he experienced horrific and barbaric torture for many years throughout his enslavement, particularly because he tried to liberate himself between, by his count, between 16 and 20 times. And each time he was caught, arrested, incarcerated, and tortured. So in his lectures, he always exhibited weapons of torture to really illustrate the reality of enslavement and his own experience. And that links to his autobiography as well, because his autobiography was really the first autobiography by an enslaved person to depict and to include illustrations, and those illustrations were of his own torture. But throughout his lectures, he also constantly talked about how, although he had finally liberated himself, he could not call himself free until his family were liberated, until others were liberated as well. And I've talked a lot about uh, newspapers and the sources that we have for a roper. On the one hand, we have quite a bit, but on the other hand, we do not. And largely that's because, as historians, and particularly historians of enslavement, we inevitably face erasures and silences in the white supremacist archive when we try and tell even just a fraction of this story. And we have vast gaps in our knowledge about Moses Roper, about his time in Canada, particularly in the early 1850s, and also what he was doing during the US Civil War and post-Civil War as well. We know that he is living in New York in 1866, but then the next trace of him, really, concrete trace of him, is then in Vermont 2 decades later. So there are vast, vast gaps in our knowledge around his life. And so far as we know, Roper didn't leave behind a vast collection of letters or images that particularly were saved because he didn't have the same sort of anti-slavery and abolitionist networks and friendships that someone like Frederick Douglass had, perhaps. So we have to try and be really creative with some of the sources that we're trying to tell at least a part of his story. And I've mentioned his autobiography, and actually the autobiography contains the only extant image of Roper so far, but we also have handbills for his lectures, and we can actually learn quite a lot about those handbills. With all of the text on them. But we can also add to that newspaper reports and speeches, adverts, autograph books, letters, ink stamps, as I showed in the first part of this talk, poetry, even address cards. But all of these sources have inherent problems, particularly newspapers, because white newspaper correspondents would write a coverage of a particular speech. So already you're trying to access Moses Roper's voice and words through a white lens, essentially a white man's lens, but also because many of those white male newspaper correspondents would write very racialized descriptions of Moses Roper and very racist descriptions, particularly if they disagreed with the message that he was discussing in his lectures, particularly when he was talking about in graphic detail the violence and the torture that he had experienced. White male newspaper correspondents often and sometimes rejected that, accused him of lying because the stories that he told were deemed to be so unbelievable. So where we left off in the last talk was to discuss the manner of Moses Roper's death. And just to recap a little bit, he died in Boston City Hospital on April the 15th in 1891. And his death certificate is actually registered. His cause of death is cardiac and pulmonary disease. He's actually registered as white, which is obviously an error. It says he's also 75 years old. He's widowed, and his occupation he actually lists it as a lecturer, which is interesting because previously he'd been working as a farmhand in Maine shortly before he died. And he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Boston. And we actually know the location of where he's buried. We know the grave, we know the row, the section, but there is no marker. And as of a couple of years ago, there are no markers actually allowed in this space in the cemetery because Roper is buried in a small mass grave for what is labelled as the indigent, or essentially for the poor and the needy. Now, when Roper was lying in hospital, as he lay dying, he had a handbill in his pocket for one of lectures that he had tried to give recently, but he also had $100 left on his person. And he alludes to this in an interview given to a newspaper, and he specifically says that he doesn't want to be treated as a pauper. He has this money on his person. Now, Roper ends up in a pauper's grave, which is even more tragic because he is saying in this interview that he is not a pauper and he should not be buried like one. A huge injustice that deserves some form of correction. And we don't know what happened to that $100. Was that taken from him or deducted from him to cover those hospital bills? But essentially, he is lying in that pauper's grave. And by telling this story, we can and trying to honor him and trying to think about ways in which we can honor him with a marker or something. We obviously need to recognize the complexity of honoring someone in a pauper's grave when he's buried side by side with others who also did not receive proper burials. But we do know that plot and grave number, and we have to think about how we could use that space to try and honor this freedom fighter who has long been forgotten and whose story has been erased from our records. And one of the things that Caroline asked me to sort of wrap up these conversations is to really have a think about why telling Roper's story now really matters. And there's so many reasons for that. I think the lack of awareness around him speaks to a deliberate erasure of his life from the records, and correcting that injustice of his life is always going to be relevant, but particularly where we know where he is buried, and correcting that injustice, or at least honoring his memory and with a marker or something like that would be a really, really powerful way of commemorating his life of sacrifice that he had. I think Moses Roper is always going to be relevant as long as racism exists. We have our current climate of, and just here in the UK, I'm recording this in just early October 2025, but just a few weeks ago here in the UK, we had one of the largest far-right racist rallies that we've ever had in this country. And obviously, we know the racist administration of President Trump. Um, and especially his attacks actually against Black history in general, and particularly the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is a really, really terrifying consequences essentially, and it shows us more than ever that we should really continue to respect, honor, and embrace the philosophies of activists like Roper, who were calling out racism, white supremacy nearly 2 centuries ago. And there are so many contemporary parallels from his story to now. We have racist and white supremacist media coverage, particularly of African Americans in the US, whether that is to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, whether that is to do with police incarceration and police brutality. And this is something that Roper was struggling with as he was traveling around Britain and in the US, but particularly in Britain. He's really struggling against white British newspaper correspondents who I mentioned earlier, who were writing very racist things about him. And not only, again, racialized descriptions of his body and who he was, but very racist descriptions of his message of who he was, trying to ruin his reputation, trying to essentially discredit what he was saying about enslavement, trying to say that Roper was lying. So this had a huge impact on Roper's tour nearly 2 centuries ago. But this has a huge impact for when we come to study Roper's life and story. I think this also links to the denial of African American experiences. White British newspaper correspondents were quite literally saying that Roper was lying. Roper was talking about the torture, the extensive and barbaric torture that he'd experienced. And he was saying that in several of his meetings that he had been whipped 150 times in one sitting. And he refused to exhibit his own bodily scars to audience members. And there were several white men in the audience who would stand up and say it was physically impossible to survive such torture. And Roper was lying. So he has that to deal with, but then he also has the newspaper reports that would have been distributed amongst the local community saying that this man was lying. So Roper had to combat that in some of his lectures. He even made the decision to be independent in terms of he didn't necessarily speak alongside specific religious networks, or he didn't necessarily want a chairman. He wanted to be his own chairman in meetings because then he had the power and the control of their own meeting without somebody else enforcing their own views or racialized views or on Roper or the meeting. Roper could literally lead that meeting in the direction that he wanted, and that he was able to have that independence to discuss his life story as freely as possible. So he's combating all of that as well as the trauma of recounting those stories about his life, those stories of horrific torture, as if recounting those memories were not enough. He has to deal with that white supremacist ideology of people combating and completely disrespecting him, disrespecting his life and story. And this is part of a larger story of how the anti-slavery movement, the white anti-slavery movement, was one of um, in large part racist practice where white British abolitionists would, and particularly on this side of the Atlantic, although it did happen in the US as well, but white British abolitionists would have extensive ways to try and test the story of an African American, particularly one who'd been born into enslavement. They wanted to interrogate them and essentially try and prove, again, in inverted commas, that they had actually been enslaved. So they are, from a starting point, they are trying to investigate whether a person's story is worth telling and whether they are truthful. And some of them were doing that to try and anticipate and combat a white supremacist ideology that many audiences in Britain subscribe to, in the sense that they had to have copious amounts of evidence to say that this person was enslaved, therefore their story was accurate. But again, the impact that that had on African Americans who had genuinely experienced a lifetime of cruelty and barbarism, and then having to face this interrogation to essentially prove their own life stories, was incredibly degrading and disrespecting and dehumanizing. It's another form of dehumanization. And this also links to, again, thinking about these contemporary parallels, the contemporary violence and violation towards Black bodies when we think about the police brutality against people of color in the United States. When we think about what some activists have referred to as contemporary lynching. So Roper's story is always going to be tied into that. His story after the Civil War as well, he really struggles to make a life for himself. He suffers from poverty, he suffers from financial hardship. And this is a larger story of freedom fighters, of people who were born into enslavement, trying to survive, trying to thrive, trying to literally take each day as it comes in a white supremacist state that was trying to oppress African Americans in every aspect of their life. The other thing that I always try and mention in terms of these contemporary parallels and why Moses Roper's story is relevant now is what we would term in today's sort of language as white performative allyship. So how white allies today say they might support Black Lives Matter, might support Black people in, in their own companies and jobs, things like that. But actually, when it comes to performing the hard, actually walking the walk and talking the talk, that many white allies do not live up to that definition of allyship. And this is very, very present in conversations around the Black Lives Matter movement today, and actually how far are white British, white American people prepared to go in terms of supporting racial justice and racial equality. And we see that performative allyship, if we can use a contemporary term, with Moses Roper, because he worked with several anti-slavery activists, particularly in the beginning of his career. George Thompson, a very well-known anti-slavery activist and abolitionist who had copious networks of support here, but also particularly in the US, as well as other abolitionists. And there were a couple of abolitionists that really, really supported Roper, Henry Christopherson, in particular, really early on. But there were other activists like Thomas Price, Wilson Armistead, Richard D. Webb, who wrote very damaging things, either in private or in public, to try and discredit Roper's reputation. And Thomas Price is one of them. He wrote several letters to the newspaper, The Patriot, based in London, trying to discredit Moses Roper's reputation. And in a series of letters, Roper actually writes back, and you can tell that he's trying to defend his reputation because his very livelihood, his survival, and also his family survival depends on it. By this point, Roper is married to a white English woman and has two children and two daughters. So he's trying to make a life for his family. So that letter that, or one of the letters that Price writes, where he is condemning Moses Roper and causing him essentially to be and calling him a beggar and a liar. Again, the sort of racialized terms here. Um, Roper's trying to defend his reputation. He is literally having doors closed in his face as he's trying to build a lecture circuit and to try and give lectures all the way around at this particular point, London and Essex. And by having doors closed in his face, he is not able to give lectures. He's not able to raise money to pay the printers of his autobiography. So then he's worried about debt, and then he's worried about debtor's prison. And knowing what we know of Roper's life and the numerous times that he was incarcerated for trying to liberate himself, all of this would have been deeply traumatic on several different layers. Again, he's not only trying to prove himself to, or prove his story to white audiences. And I would say he was a very bold, radical activist. He did not waste time necessarily trying to prove himself. He always, in his words, told the truth of his experiences, and that is the spirit that he lived by. So when we tell stories and when we talk about the white anti-slavery movement, we need to talk about those divisions. We need to talk about that, and this is a point that I make in most of my talks and tours. If you are an anti-slavery activist or you subscribed to be an abolitionist, you may have believed in abolition, the end of enslavement, but you may have been anti-slavery, but you would not necessarily have been anti-racist. And again, the difference between that and actually someone who was deeply committed to Black rights and Black civil rights, that difference was pretty vast, depending on who we're talking about. And just finally, I just want to talk very briefly about the really sort of powerful platform and medium that Douglas Week can give to these stories. And Douglas Week has been happening for sort of 5 years now, and it's a really, really brilliant opportunity to talk about African American freedom fighters, of course, like Frederick Douglass, but of course, like Moses Roper as well. And I think that it's important to have this growing awareness of his own pioneering life, but also the wider social justice movement in general. We can place Roper alongside figures like Frederick Douglass to sort of build a greater patchwork of activism, not only in the US, but also sort of around the UK and across the globe. And these historical erasures are deliberate, of Roper's life, of parts of this story. They are part of a white supremacist society. So actually, by trying to speak these stories aloud, speak them into being, it really shares those stories and it shatters some of those walls, particularly when it comes around to Moses Roper, who, as I mentioned, in his own words, he wanted to tell the truth about enslavement and racism. So that is something that we can do as well. And I think that there are ways for you as well, for audience members, to sort of read about Moses Roper's life and tell his story for your teachers. I have numerous teaching resources that I go into schools with, and I'm more than happy to share them. So please do get in touch. But by reading, by teaching about his life, by digesting information about his life, his autobiography is free and is online via the website Documenting the US South. So you're able to read that online if you would like. But again, share those stories, and particularly if you're based here in Britain or or in Ireland, if you live near a site where he lectured, shout about it. And again, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me if you'd like some more information on that. And I think finally, living by some of his lessons, calling out racism, calling out acts of injustice when we see it, telling the truth about our past here in the UK when it comes to race, when it comes to enslavement, when it comes to empire. And again, similar in the US, particularly right now when US history is under attack from the current administration, telling the story of enslavement, of empire, truthfully and empathetically, with humanizing people who were colonized, people who were enslaved, and in society in general. So thank you so much for listening. Do check out some of the other talks here for Douglas Week, and I wish you all well.